Well, here we are in Australia on a sunny day and feeling incredibly privileged to be here for maybe another chapter in Ashes history. Who knows, with 5 test matches lying ahead in the future, anything is possible. And with me are our correspondent Jonathan Agnew, who's covering his 9th Ashes tour, Stephen Finn, who's toured here 3 times, including England's last win 10 years ago, TMS commentator Simon Mann, and to add a historic and statistical perspective, Andy Zaltzman. Let's just start by delving into the memory banks and having some thoughts about when the Ashes in Australia first entered our consciousness. I suppose I remember the centenary test of 1977, listening during the night, but that wasn't part of an Ashes series, so it doesn't really count. But Simon, when do you remember first listening through the night?
First one, there was an amazing game. I remember listening to most of that game through the night as well. 74-5, the Dennis Lillee Tomo tour. If Lillee doesn't get you, Tomo must. And in those days, Test Match Special did carry commentary, but only the last session of the day. It's remarkable to think back that we didn't have through-the-night commentary. There was no through-the-night television. That was a sort of 1990s thing. So you had the last session of the day, and I can remember I woke up every morning of that series in time to listen to the last session without fail, even though England were 13-0 down when it came towards the end of the series. I woke up because I was absolutely obsessed by cricket as a boy, and it was that moment where you looked at your watch and it was just coming up to 4 o'clock, and you knew that shortly they would go on air, and you were thinking that you had no idea what was going to happen. Absolutely no idea. There was obviously no internet. There was no sort of texting or anything like that. You had literally no idea what the score was going to be after 2 sessions of each day. So there was a real sense of excitement. What were the commentators going to say? What was going to be the tone of the presenter in the studio? Because obviously he knew what the score was going to be. So you could almost sense from the first thing that he said how it had been going for England or otherwise. And normally, on that tour, it went pretty bad. So it was amazing. Mate, you really did sort of have that sense of being, of the Ashes being such a long distance away. So it was a remarkable feeling, really, and Tomo and Lillee, and then you wanted to see these guys. They were terrorising England. You wanted to see them in action. You wanted to see Tomo, and then there were the highlights in the evening every day on the BBC, half an hour of highlights, and you saw Tomo with this slingshot action terrorising England's top order. Yeah,
I think I could probably say, because it's only 4 years ago that I got to my first Ashes tour out here, Jonathan, having been a cricket fan all my life, really, and I think I could probably say, Ags, that you've been responsible for some of my best moments in the early hours of the morning, with more often worst moments in the early hours of the morning.
Let's clarify that, Eleanor. But
because it is that moment, as Simon says. You wake up and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and you're kind of half awake, and you switch the radio on, and you're just waiting for the score. You're waiting for that first score, and sometimes you're not fully there. And of course, with TMS are extremely good at giving the score all the time, but you might have lain there for a second and you thought, Who's the bowler? Who's the batsman? Oh no! That's the number 8 is in already.
Can't work it all out.
But I mean, for you, when was your first?
Well, I don't suppose many around this table will have the team photograph of Ray Illingworth's Ashes winning team from 1970-71. But that was my first connection. Really, I was 10 then. 10, going in on 11, and so I was into cricket then. And I just remember. I don't know how I got that team photo. But looking back at it now, there's Illy was captain, and I played under Ray Illingworth, and my hero Peter Lever was there. It was a young Bob Willis was sent out as a replacement for Alan Ward, and it was an heroic tour. Incident packed. There was John Snow's incident on the hill at Sydney, of course, when a spectator grabbed him and so on. The players all got together in the middle and refused to carry on, beer cans flying, all that sort of stuff, and that did fire the imagination a bit. Then, of course, Australia came to England, and that was Bob Massey and Dennis Lillee and Ian Chappell, and so just gradually, and I'm like Simon, I guess 74-5. I was banged up at school, so I couldn't really listen very much, although I tried hard to. And I never saw the highlights. It's always been it was for years a real frustration of mine that I never saw any of that series, because I didn't have access to a television, and I've managed on I think a tour here to get an old VHS of it, so I could actually watch them and see Keith Fletcher getting hit on the cap, on that badge, from a quick ball, and actually the ball being caught at cover. This is serious. This is serious stuff. Colin Cowdrey going out, his rescue act and so on. But again, like you, listening through the night, to Centenary Test. Alan McGilvray's voice really resonated, and because it sounded a long way away, and of course it was very Australian, and they gave the score all wrong, and these strange things called sundries, and so you think, what's all this about? But it just, I think lying in bed listening in the dark, I know that from listeners' feedback, is actually because you can let your imagination just run riot a bit, and you have to try and fill in the gaps that we don't give, and you do lie there conjuring up the images that we hopefully help. You don't always get them right, and sometimes they're completely different, but lying there in bed at night with your earplugs in, eyes shut, listening to the cricket is, I think, just an absolute. It's a magical experience. Hopefully.
Yeah, the crackly 4-wire. I think there's what.
Yeah, it's not so crackly these days.
No,
and
it's not. It's very clear.
People can grumble about that a bit, but that's modern technology, and it does sound. Hopefully, sounds as if we're almost in the room next door. But there was a bit of magic about that, about the delay and about the crackle, certainly.
Finny, what about you? Because you are of an era when you could actually watch TV through the night as a youngster.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of times I was actually allowed to do it because of school and stuff was limited, so I'd generally stay out to watch the first session and then go to bed and wake up for school and that the next morning. But the first Ashes series that was in my consciousness probably was the 0-2-3 Ashes here, when Michael Vaughan scored all the runs. And that's when I was like acutely aware of it. But then the first one that I took a great real interest in were the 6-7 Ashes, and the one day of cricket that I remember staying up later than maybe I should have done was the day where Paul Collingwood got all his runs in the Adelaide Test match. I don't really remember much of the first Test. I mean, the Harmison first ball, but yeah, the one where I was like, wow, England are doing amazing here, was that day in Adelaide when Paul Collingwood scored the runs, and then 4 years later I was there playing with him, and I was like, what on earth is going on? And like in this parallel universe where I'd transported myself from being on my sofa watching it 4 years earlier to being in the team with these guys. So it was a real surreal experience.
I love that shout he gave, because he hit the ball straight down the ground, and he knew it was going to be his 200. And he shouted almost as the moment he played the shot. They could hear it in our headphones and so on off the pitch mics. It was a brilliant moment.
That was amazing.
And so what was it like for you to be here for the first time as a player? I mean, what was that? Can you sum up what that excitement felt like?
Well, I think you come into it completely naive, because everyone talks about how difficult it is and how tough it is, and a lot of the rhetoric about the way we speak about it is it's hostile, it's hard. So I sort of anticipated it being this nasty place where everyone got stuck into you. You walk down the street and people are abusing you, and it's a bit like that. And you're English, and people do enjoy sticking a knife into you when you're walking down the street. But that first tour, I was naive to that in the beginning, and then we drew that first Test match and then won the second, and all of a sudden the Australians were being friendly to us, and all the other guys were a bit like, well, why on earth are they all being friendly to us? But it's because we'd won their respect. So that's my big memories of that first tour, were the fact that the Australian people actually quite liked us. And then on subsequent tours I realised that's not actually the case, that they really don't like us, and they were just, it was like a feigned niceness because we were actually beating them at cricket.
Andy, what about you? What was your first Ashes memory down under?
Well, my first memory of Ashes in Australia was 1982-3, when I'd have been 8 years old, and I'd become obsessed by cricket in the end of the 81 summer. And my dad had bought me books that had all Bill Frindle's stats in the back, and it was already clear by that stage in my life that playing was not going to be a huge success. So I became obsessed with the numbers. But I remember in that 82-3 series, when Norman Cowans took 6 wickets at Melbourne, it was the fourth Test, England were 2-0 down, so they had to win to stay in the series. They held the Ashes from 1981. And I just remember breakfast news as a child about to go to school, seeing Norman Cowans had taken 6 wickets, and they were on the verge of victory, Australia 9 down, and then that dramatic fifth day when Australia almost got over the line with Border and Thompson. And then my second memory is the next day's breakfast news, seeing the winning catch, Botham bowling to Jeff Thompson, dropped by Chris Tavares, and Jeff Miller caught the rebound, and that's one of the sort of strongest memories of my entire childhood, really, and the excitement of that thing. England still had a chance. In terms of radio, I remember my first memory of listening to the Ashes was that 1990-91 series, and we sort of tend to think of England just losing all the time there, but they went into that series having had a really good summer. They'd beaten New Zealand and India. They'd had a good tour in the West Indies, had won in the West Indies for the first time in a long time. Should have gone 2-0 up in that series, so they were on a bit of an upward curve, and then they were bowled out on the first day of the series, but the second day, I remember vividly sitting up at night, and I'd school the next day, I think, past midnight, and they had Australia at 64 for 5, and I remember the fifth wicket was Steve Waugh, just checking, looking at the scorecard now, and he was caught by Robin Smith off Gladstone Small, and I remember jumping around my bedroom in the middle of the night thinking, yes, we're going to be, because they've been hammered in 1989, and sort of growing up through the 80s, England had struggled against most people, but done quite well in the Ashes, so it felt like this was an opportunity, and then of course ended up losing the game by 10 wickets and losing the series 3-0, and it was just a decade and a half of pure misery after that, but that moment sticks in my mind very clearly.
And that 1991 tour, Agus, so you were there as a journalist, so this is early part of your career. Your first test, and it's the thing, isn't it, when you kind of jokingly say to a recently retired player who's gone into the press box, hope you brought your boots with you. Yes. That actually happened to you, didn't it?
Well, it did, because I'd retired that previous summer, and so I did take my bowling boots out, and in the warm-ups in Perth and so on, I bowled a lot in the nets actually, and I enjoyed it. But Mike Selvey, I remember, kept saying to me, you can't have a foot in both camps. You can't do it. You'll get caught out. And I thought, I'll be all right. And we got to Brisbane, and of course Gooch, was talked about in a previous podcast, was out because he'd had that finger injury, playing tennis. He'd had an operation. So Alan Lamb was captain. And I remember 2 days before, which was always the preview day here in Australia for the journalists, my little light was flashing on my phone in my hotel room, and sure enough, there was a message from Mickey Stewart saying, please bring your boots and come along and bowl. So of course I did. And we just waited to go out and bowl on the nets and so on, and Peter Lush, who was the manager, came over to us hacks and said, look, I'm sorry, as you know, there was all a bit of pressure going on here, but there'll be no captain's press conference today. So we'll say, hang on a minute, you've got a new captain. You've got Alan Lamb as captain. It's the first test of the Ashes. This is ridiculous. You've got to have a press conference. He said, no press conference. And so I'm standing there with my whites on and my boots amongst the sun and the mirror and the mail and everything else. And I could almost feel the eyes sort of burning into me, So I said, well, in that case, Peter, I'm afraid I really can't come and bowl in the nets.
Because that would have given you an exclusive access that the other press guys weren't going to get.
Well, it would, but also, I'm now one of them. I'm a hack. This was a test of loyalty, really. So I said I can't come and bowl in the nets. So the next day, the Sun newspaper ran the headline: Agnew tells England to get stuffed, which I thought was a little harsh, but it does demonstrate, you can get caught, and especially as a tabloid writer. And there was a little bit of feeling about a player coming in and taking a writer's job in those days anyway. So that was an early challenge of it, and Mike was quite right. And my bowling boots are still in that hotel in Brisbane. I took them back there and just gave them to the concierge and said they'll do something with those. So they're probably still in a plastic bag somewhere in the hotel in Brisbane.
Can you imagine that now, Finny, that one of the press pack comes out, or have any of them done it in your time? Has anyone come out of the press box and had a bowl? Or
No, well, I actually do have my boots, and when I went to New Zealand with TMS in 2019, I remember Joe Root saying to me a few times, come down and have a bowl at the boys, and I would do it. I think I would do it, but because of COVID and everything here, it's going to be difficult. But my bowling boots are in my bag, and with all the travel restrictions that are happening now, I still hold out hope to play my 37th Test.
You never know.
Well, you never know. No, exactly. You're just talking about injuries at the Gabba. It could happen. Simon, so when you came here for the first time, this is your fifth tour, isn't it? On the Ashes.
Yeah, it's probably my 10th time to Australia, a couple of World Cups. I did. First time I came here was an England A tour, actually, before the 94 5 Ashes. England, they sort of cobbled together an A team to come out here and play, and it was actually sort of a bit like jobs for the boys. It wasn't like they do now with the Lions, where they look at all the promising young players. There were one or two promising young players. Actually, Mark Latwell was on that tour, and he made a brilliant 100 at the SCG. I think Glenn McGrath was playing, and one or two other very good Australian bowlers. He made this wonderful 100, and he thought, here's a test player of the future. And of course, he did play a couple of test matches, but I don't think he ever really believed in himself, Mark Latwell, and I don't think he thought he should be playing. So that was an A tour, and then 94-5. Those vivid memories of that first ball, Slater smashing Martin McCaig, going off the field injured. I don't think that endeared himself very much to Michael Atherton, England's captain on that tour. It was a tough old tour. Australia batting first, and Martin McCaig, he didn't last the Test match. I think he had a stomach upset. I think there was a feeling that you've got to tough it out. What was it? What was the Australian? Malcolm Conn described Martin McCaig
because he's Australian.
He was Australian, yeah.
He
was the rat who joined the sinking ship. I liked Martin actually. He was a nice bloke. Yeah, I got to know him on A tour, and then he went on the 94-5 tour, but he didn't actually cover himself with that much glory.
And Agaz, as a young cricketer, you came out here, didn't you? I mean, obviously not an Ashes, not playing in the Ashes, but you came out as a player.
Yeah, when after I only played 3 first-class games at the end of one summer, and it was I was 18, and they had in those days something called a Whitbread Scholarship, which they would give to sort of promising young, maybe 3 or 4 of the time. I think Ian Botham was the year before me. It's when he had that infamous dust-up with Ian Chappell. That was on his Whitbread Scholarship. So basically he gets flown off to Australia and go and play grade cricket, which was great. I mean, unfortunately there was no... I wish there'd been more structure to it. I mean, more training schedules and that sort of thing. There was nothing really. I was just flown out there as an 18-year-old, didn't know anybody. I was told by Colin Cowdrey, who was sort of the face of the Whitbread, Frank will be there to meet you. And I said, okay, thank you. And flew off, arrived in Melbourne, 18 years old, no idea where I was. Sure enough, there's this fellow there, bald bloke, had a sign up saying Jonathan Agnew. And I'm Frank, hello. I thought, hello Frank, nice to meet you. Went and stayed at Frank's house, and it took about a week to realise it was Frank Tyson. I had no idea who this Frank was, a nice chap. But I didn't know who he was. And Frank...
One of the greatest fast bowlers of all time.
Exactly. Frank, he liked a beer in the evening, Frank, but I mean only a very, very, very small one. I don't think Frank would ever claim to have necessarily held his drink particularly well. And so he'd have a sip, and suddenly this sort of red mist would come down. You think you're fast, do you? I'll show you. And he'd grab a tennis ball from somewhere and go into his garden and be sort of slinging the ball down all over his garden into the hedges, and be scrambling to get the ball back with that famous slingy action of his. You think you're fast? I'll show you what fast is. And I had a very enjoyable month with Frank, who was a lovely bloke, and he did all the coaching he ran the coaching for Victoria Cricket Association. And so during the week, he would send me off around coaching around the schools in Victoria and so on. So I saw a lot of the countryside doing that, and then go and play great cricket on the weekends, which is quite an education.
Baby crying there. The mere mention of Frank Tyson still a reaction from Australia.
Terror in the Australians, quite right.
Destroyed them in the that 54-55. Actually, he said 25 wickets in the 3 tests that England won.
Wow.
Richie Beno still says it's the fastest bowling I've ever seen.
Yeah. Let's go down. Let's drill it down to the great openings, the great opening moments that we've seen in Ashes Test history at the Gabba, because people will remember Steve Harmison's first ball, but there have been some pretty memorable moments for all sorts of the right and the wrong reasons.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that's probably the most memorable first ball of any series, when Steve Harmison rewrote the laws of physics with a delivery that went to first slip, and that sort of presaged a 5-0 defeat after England had that fantastic win in 2005, which Harmison was such a big part. And I mean, we mentioned how England's had these sort of terrible micro starts in Brisbane. That first ball from De Freitas to Slater in 1994-95 after Australia won the toss on a good batting pitch. They ended day one 329 for 4, and then Shane Warne took 11 wickets in the game. Nasser Hussain winning the toss. So that was 0 balls in. Things started going wrong when he put Australia in to bat. They were 125 for 1 at lunch in that game, and 364 for 2 at the close of day one. The Harmison ball in 06-7, 109 for 1 at lunch, Australia, and 346 for 3 at the end of day one. So some pretty poor starts. Then Strauss out in the first over that Finney mentioned. England bowled out in the first day. Peter Siddle took a hat-trick. Of course, that game ended well, but it was another sort of tough beginning to the Ashes. But I mean, recently the bowlers have struggled in the opening session at Brisbane. The last 7 Ashes tests there, just a total of 8 wickets in the opening session. So it has tended to be dominated by the batters early on.
Siddle's hat-trick was his birthday, wasn't it, as well, I think? Just
I
to
think
crown
it
that. No, I said the Harmison one. So poor old Steve does that, and England get hammered. And of course we're all getting stuck in, and the body language looked awful. He just felt like the Ashes had gone already. And I remember going to Adelaide, and I was on about, I don't know, the 12th floor of the hotel, I suppose, there, and I pressed the lift to go down, and I see it coming down. Waiting. Lift door opens, and there's one other person in the lift, 12 floors up. It's Steve Harmison. The lift door closes, and I'm trapped in there with Steve all the way down to the bottom. And we sort of looked at each other, and we said, he's actually carrying his bowling boots. I said, where are you off to, Steve? He said, I'm just going to the nets. Like he did to the practice, and lift door open. I've never been so pleased to see those lift doors open at the bottom.
I mean, in terms of the stats, there's a slight curiosity with the end of day one in Brisbane, 21 Ashes tests in Brisbane, and the team batting at the end of day one has only lost twice. One of them was England's last match there, 2017. They were 196 for 4 after James Vince and Stoneman had batted very well on the first day of the series, and then 1982 England were 219 for 9 at the end of day one. Other than that, the team that's been at the crease, whether they batted first or bowled the opposition out and had started their first innings, has not lost an Ashes test at Brisbane.
That Harmison ball, Aggers, because you were on commentary for TMS. Jim Maxwell was on commentary for the ABC, wasn't he? I think it'd be fair to say that your commentary is rather different.
They sound very different. I mean, you can almost hear the whoops of glee on the ABC version, whereas mine was just sort of complete disbelief. I think, remember, it was just so horribly wretched. I mean, it was just. But looking at it back now, is the way that Freddie just caught it and just tossed it back as if it was like catching practice before the game, and you can see there's a bit of bemusement around, like people thinking, did I see that properly? Did that really happen? But it just you could just feel the deflation, boom, because it just betrayed, I'm afraid, all the anxiety and the nerves and everything else going into this, into that, a massive game, and
with the memories of the 05 series still so fresh as well.
Yeah, and it was interesting, that game, because I don't think people realise quite how hard Australia were going to come back after 2005. I really think England didn't really get that. With their preparation, their build-up, and you just sense. I remember in 2005, the Australians at the Oval watching the presentations, and you could feel them, almost saying, "Right, watch it, and take this memory back with us, because we're coming back at you." And of course, they really hit England hard in that series. They were ruthless, and they 5-0.
That moment of the first ball, Finney, in the Test matches that you played at the Gabba, or you were involved with, you were out there for. What are your feelings on those days? Because I mean, I suppose everybody in the back of their mind had that Steve Harmison ball.
The one Test match that we played at the Gabba, we were batting, so I watched the first 4 balls, and then Strauss got out, and I disappeared back to my little rabbit hole.
Because you cursed him.
Yeah, exactly. Anyone that I watched live that game got out, so I was like, I'm getting out of here. I don't need to watch this anymore. But you're so aware of the significance of it, of starting well. I think all of the conversations that you have in the build-up to the Test matches, whether it's a press conference, a team meeting, whatever it is, you have to start well. We want to start well here and make an impression. And you try your hardest. Steve Harmison didn't run up meaning to bowl that ball to second slip. He was probably almost trying too hard to bowl the perfect delivery. So it's finding that equilibrium in that state between being really hyped up and amped up and wanting it and stressing about it being perfect, and then being too chilled and not caring. You want to be somewhere in the middle, and that's the perfect balance. But luckily, with James Anderson, if he bowled a ball to second slip, there would be something very, very, very wrong with the world if that happened. So I don't think that it's going to happen this time round. Actually, talking about the build-up to the first ball of the first day of an Ashes Test match, in the 13-14 series here, it was Kevin Peterson's 100th Test match. And when you play your 100th Test match, you get a commemorative silver cap on a tray. It's beautiful, in this glass box that says, "Congratulations, you've played 100 Test matches." And Giles Clarke came out to the middle to present Kevin with his silver cap. And I remember him doing this speech about saying what a great servant Kevin had been, rightly so, to the England team, and gave him his silver cap. I remember Kevin looking at it, really proud. "I've played 100 Test matches." And then he looked a bit closer, and it said, Kevin Peterson. They spelt his name wrong on the silver cap. So I had to give it back to Giles Clark. Pretty annoyed. Like, I've played 100 test matches for you. I've been one of your greatest players ever, and you can't even spell my name right on my commemorative hat. And that was a signal of how the rest of that series was going to go.
Do you don't have to wear the silver cap during the game?
Well, it'd make it a lot hotter and a lot harder work than it already is.
Quick thought about Nasser, that toss, that notorious toss.
Well, all I can remember about that was that I was sent down because there was a sort of general air of disbelief, and I don't think we were actually on the air at the time, but so word got out that England won the toss and put Australia in. And I think Peter Baxter, the producer at the time, sent me downstairs to check. I went down to where the dressing rooms are, and there's a lot of shouting going on. and I asked someone down there, I can't remember one of the other players. I think the 12th man onwards, I sort of evacuated the dressing room. And I asked one of them, so right, we stuck him in. They sort of, yes. So I went back up. And that was really all I can remember about the actual thing. But there was a general, total disbelief at what had happened. I think it did do a little bit, but again we didn't bowl very well. But it was more of a defensive decision, really. I think Nasser worked out some sort of way in which he thought it was the least likely way that England would lose the game by letting them bat first. But it was a bizarre one.
Well, actually, if you listen to Nathan Lehman on this, who is England's stats guru, he says actually did reduce England's chances of losing the match statistically. I asked Nasser about this because I wrote an article about it, the importance of winning the toss, and he said, nah, he says, total cock up.